Ladies and gentlemen, friends from across the nation and around the world, my name is Gerald Ford, and I welcome you to a journey through a life that was never meant to be extraordinary, yet became deeply intertwined with some of the most turbulent moments in American history. I was not born into privileged, I was not destined for high office. No one expected that a boy from Grand Rapids, Michigan, raised by a hardworking mother and a steady, loving stepfather, would one day sit behind the resolute desk of the Oval Office. And truth be told, neither did I, yet history has a way of calling on ordinary people in extraordinary times. Across the next 6 hours, I will not speak to you as a symbol, nor as a title, nor as the 38th President of the United States. I will speak to you as Jerry, a son, a husband, a father, a student, a sailor, a congressman, and a man who found himself in a moment when the nation needed steadiness more than glory, healing more than triumph, honesty more than elegance. You will walk with me through my childhood streets in Grand Rapids, stand at the sidelines of the football fields where discipline and teamwork forged my character, step aboard the Navy carrier decks where the Pacific winds carried the echoes of war, and sit inside the quiet offices of Congress where decades of public service shaped my belief in fairness, integrity, and common sense. You will witness the unraveling of a presidency during Watergate, the rising tension, the investigations, the loss of trust, and feel the weight that fell upon me the moment Richard Nixon said the words, "I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow." I entered the Oval Office not with celebration, but with solemn duty. No inaugural parade, no cheering crowds, only a nation bruised, divided, and uncertain of its future. And it fell to me to say what I believe deep in my heart. Our long national nightmare is over. But history is rarely that simple. In the hours ahead, I will share with you the difficult choices that defined my time in the White House, the decision to issue a pardon that nearly cost me everything, the struggle to tame inflation and hold together a fragile economy, the effort to restore American credibility abroad, and the constant, quiet resolve to rebuild trust in a government shaken to its core. And after the presidency, the story did not end, for in private life, I discovered new ways to serve, to support my wife Betty as she changed the national conversation about health and recovery, and to reflect on what leadership means in a world that grows more complicated by the year. Why life has been tested, criticized, misunderstood, and sometimes forgotten. But through it all, I tried my best to live by the values my parents taught me. Tell the truth. Do your best. Help others. Keep your word. Simple values. For complicated times come with me now, not to revisit the headlines, but to see the world from behind my eyes, to understand not only what I did, but why I did it. Not only the decisions I made, but the man who made them. This is my story, a story of humility, duty, uncertainty, courage, disappointment, hope, and ultimately, faith in the American people. Let us begin. As I look back across the decades, I often remind myself that nothing about my journey was inevitable. I was not a man who sought power for its own sake. I was not a visionary in the way some presidents are remembered. I did not bring sweeping or dramatic rhetoric to the podium, nor did I imagine myself as a figure meant to reshape the world. My purpose was simpler, yet no less important. To bring steadiness where there was turmoil, to bring honesty where there was doubt, and to bring calm where there was fear. But before we move through the twists and pressures of my time as president, it is important for you to understand the world into which I stepped. The America that existed in those tense days of the mid-1970s, when I took the oath of office on August 9, 1974, the nation was exhausted. The Vietnam War had left millions disillusioned and grieving. The economy was battered by inflation, unemployment, and an oil crisis that shook the foundations of modern life. Public trust in government, the most vital ingredient of a functioning democracy, had eroded to levels not seen in our history. Congress was at war with the White House. Young people felt betrayed. Older generations felt uncertain. And nearly everybody wondered whether the system itself had failed. You must know this atmosphere to understand the choices I later made. You must feel the weight of that memento, understand the man I became. I remember the silence in the White House on the afternoon I took the oath. A silence unbroken by celebration, a silence that felt almost sacred. There were no marching bands, no inaugural balls, no fireworks marking the occasion. Instead, there were tight faces, careful handshakes, and the lingering question that hung in every room. What happens now? I understood that question. I felt it deeply, because it was the very question I asked myself. For the first time in our history, a president had taken office not because of an election, but because of a crisis. And for the first time, the American people had to decide whether they could trust a leader they had never been asked to choose. I knew that my first task was not passing legislation, not reshaping foreign policy, not introducing sweeping programs, but something far more difficult. I had to restore faith in the rule of law, faith in our institutions, faith in the idea that government could still be honest, that public service could still be noble, that leadership could still be grounded in integrity rather than ambition. Those early days felt like walking across a broken bridge, one careful step at a time. Every decision mattered, every word mattered, every gesture mattered. And so I promised myself that I would lead not as a political strategist, not as a partisan warrior, but as a servant of the Constitution, a man who understood that the presidency belongs not to the one who occupies the office, but to the people who built the nation and entrusted its direction to their representatives. But to understand how I approached this nearly impossible moment, you must know the path that shaped me. You must know the quiet strength of my mother, the steady moral compass of the man who raised me, the lessons of teamwork learned on the football field, the discipline formed on Navy decks during the war, and the long years in Congress where compromise was not a weakness, but a mark of maturity. Before the storms of Watergate, before the controversies, before the decisions that would define my presidency, there was a boy in Grand Rapids, a student, athlete, a young lawyer, a sailor, and a public servant. To understand the man I became in 1974, we must rewind the clock more than 60 years and walk back to where it all began. Let us go there now. When I look back on my childhood in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I often marvel at how something so ordinary, so modest, so quietly American could prepare me for the storms that would one day shape my life. But that is the truth of IT. That MY Foundation was not dramatic. IT was not gilded. IT was not exceptional in the way textbooks often portray the early years of future presidents. That IT was simple, steady, and honest. And because of that, it was powerful. I was born on July 14, 1913, in Omaha, Nebraska, under a name I would not carry for much of my life. Leslie Lynch King Jr. I came into the world in a house filled not with love and comfort, but with conflict. Conflict that my mother would shield me from before I was old enough to understand what danger truly meant. My biological father was a man of wealth, but not of character. He had a volatile temper, one that could escalate from shouting to violence without warning. Shortly after I was born, his rage turned toward my mother, Dorothy, and just weeks after my birth, she gathered me into her arms and fled the house, choosing safety over status, protection over appearances. That decision changed my life more profoundly than any political appointment or vote I would ever cast. Because when she left Nebraska with an infant boy and began the difficult journey toward a safer future, she taught me something that would anchor every decision I made as a man. Courage does not always look like heroism. Sometimes, it looks like choosing the harder path because it is the right one. My mother and I moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where she had family. We lived simply, modestly, but we lived freely and safely. Those early years were not glamorous, but they were filled with a kind of warmth that money can't buy. That I had no memory of the father whose name I was born with, and that was a blessing. When I was about 3 years old, my mother met the man who would truly shape my life, Gerald Ford, the man whose name I proudly took and whose values I carried into adulthood. That he was steady, dependable, and kind. Everything my biological father was not. To this day, I cannot recall a single moment when he raised his voice in anger. His discipline was calm, rooted in fairness. His expectations were clear, rooted in responsibility. And his love for my mother, and for me, was as consistent as sunrise. It is not the dramatic men in your life who teach you the most. It is the quiet, decent ones, the ones whose presence is like the hum of a well-running engine, steady and reliable. My mother and Gerald Ford married in 1917, and I became Gerald Ford Jr., though the name would not become legal until many years later. But in my heart, I was his son from the moment he chose to be my father. Our home in Grand Rapids was not large, but it was filled with purpose. That we were a working-class family, and every person, child and adult, had duties that mattered. That we swept, we shoveled snow, we helped neighbors, we shared. What we had at no task was beneath us. In fact, my parents believed that every task, no matter how small, was an opportunity to build character. My father ran a small paint and varnish business. Some mornings I watched him head to work long before the sun had fully risen, his coat buttoned tight against the Michigan cold. He was never late. He never complained. He simply did his job, day after day, year after year, believing that honoring one's responsibilities was the true measure of a person. From my mother, I learned compassion. From my father, I learned discipline. And from both of them, I learned resilience, an invaluable lesson for the decades ahead. Growing up in Grand Rapids in the 1920s was a lesson in community. People knew each other. They looked out for one another. When someone fell on hard times, neighbors brought food, clothes, or quiet company. Service was not a slogan. It was a way of life. That I remember walking to school along streets lined with elm trees, carrying books that smelled of chalk and worn leather. That I was not the smartest boy in class, but I was diligent. That my teachers valued effort, and I learned early that persistence could outpace brilliance. One of my earliest memories of leadership came not from politics, but from the scout meetings and neighborhood games that filled the afternoons. That I was drawn to teamwork instinctively. There was something grounding about working toward a shared goal, something satisfying in seeing a group succeed because every member did their part. These lessons would follow me all the way to the halls of Congress. That we did not have much money, and I knew it. There were nights when my parents sat quietly at the kitchen table, bills in front of them, discussing what could wait until next month. But they never burdened us children with worry. Instead, they taught us appreciation for food, for warmth, for safety, for each other. Everything else was optional. I grew in strength and energy, and by the time I reached junior high, I found myself deeply connected to sports. Baseball, basketball, track. I enjoyed them all, but it was football that captured me entirely. Football demanded discipline, strategy, endurance, and above all, trust. I found satisfaction in every practice, every drill, every moment of exhaustion on the field. And my father rarely missed a game. Win or lose, he stood on the sidelines, hands in his pockets, smile firm but modest. His encouragement was never loud. It was steady, like everything else about him, and it meant more than he ever knew. At home, we lived by rules, firm but fair. Chores were completed without protest. Homework was finished before play. Dinner was eaten together, always, no exceptions. And each night, my parents asked what we had learned that day, not what we had accomplished, not whether we had won or lost, but what we had learned. Looking back, I often think that these quiet habits did more to shape me than any formal education. Leadership begins at the dinner table, long before it ever reaches a podium. But my early years were not without challenges. There was the matter of my biological father, a man I did not know, a man whose violence my mother had escaped, a man who would resurface unexpectedly years later. When I was a boy of 12, my mother told me the truth. Carefully, gently, but without hiding it. I learned that the man who had raised me was not my biological father. It was a shock, yes, but not in the way one might imagine, because by then, I knew exactly who my real father was. The man who tucked me into bed, who worked long hours, who loved my mother with unwavering loyalty. But the revelation planted something inside me, a quiet resolve to build a life defined not by the circumstances of my birth, but by the values of the man who chose to be my father. As I grew into my teenage years, I found myself increasingly aware of the world beyond Grand Rapids. The headlines spoke of war in Europe, economic turmoil, and political battles in Washington, but my world remained focused on home, school, sports, and service. That I did not yet know that public service would call to me in the years ahead, but the seeds were there, buried beneath the routines of everyday life. Those early years gave me something precious, a sense of steadiness, an anchor that would hold firm even when the storms of Watergate and national crisis threatened to pull the country apart. And so, as I look back across 90 years of life, I see that my childhood was not merely the beginning, it was the blueprint. Character is not built during moments of crisis. It is built during the quiet years, in ordinary homes, through simple lessons taught by parents who believe in honesty, discipline, and compassion. Those years in Grand Rapids made me who I am. They prepared me for Congress, They prepared me for the Navy. They prepared me for moments when the nation looked to me for calm, not charisma, for integrity, not ambition. Before I could ever serve the country, I had to be shaped by a community, guided by a family, and grounded in values that would withstand the weight of history. And that is where everything truly began. When I look back on my days in the White House, I often think of them as a time of navigating through storms. Every morning, as I walked from my bedroom to the Oval Office, those few minutes were the quietest of my day and the moments when I felt the weight of responsibility most acutely. I would often remind myself, Jerry, you must stay steady. You are not here for yourself, but for a country searching for stability. When I assumed office, the United States faced multiple crises: economic turbulence, tense international relations, social divisions, and a government barely trusted by the people. Any one of these issues alone would challenge a president, and I had to confront them all at once. Inflation roared like an uncontrollable beast, family savings were slowly eroding, unemployment was rising, and the energy crisis added more uncertainty. Every report from across the nation reminded me that people were waiting for answers, and that the president had to provide direction to address inflation. I promoted the Whip Inflation Now concept, which became a nationwide campaign. People wore buttons that read "Win." Many thought it was merely a slogan, but for me, it was a way to rally the spirit of the American people, to make them feel that we were all in the same boat. I understood that slogans alone could not solve complex economic problems, but in a moment when national morale was low, symbolism had its value. We could not turn the economy around overnight, but we could start fostering awareness that every household, every business, every community was part of a collective effort. That I carefully reviewed reports, analysis, and budget projections from economic advisors. Inflation was not the result of a single policy, but the accumulation of structural pressures over many years. Federal spending had grown steadily. The oil crisis was an external shock. Subsidies and regulations distorted resources, and past wars had left the country with a heavy fiscal burden. I had to make tough choices, cutting budgets, controlling spending, encouraging energy conservation, and asking businesses and workers to share responsibility. It was not popular, and no politician enjoys telling the public to tighten their belts, but I could not ignore reality. The nation's finances could not survive on borrowing and hope alone. That I remember countless nights sitting alone at my desk, reviewing stacks of legislation and economic data under the warm glow of the lamp. Every number, every page, demanded careful thought. Often, it was 1 or 2 in the morning, the White House quiet except for the wind outside, and I would ask myself the same questions over and over. If I sign this bill, who benefits? If I veto it, who is harmed? If I do nothing, where will the country go? The weight of responsibility was inescapable. The nation looked to me to make decisions, and there was no room for indecision. Beyond domestic economics, I faced the closing chapters of the Vietnam War. America had invested too many lives and too many resources, and the war had brought division and pain without victory. When the South Vietnamese government began to collapse, I had to make the painful decision to withdraw. It was a choice no one wanted to make, acknowledging a costly reality, yet continuing the conflict would only bring more death. I remember hearing updates from the front lines during the evacuation, each report describing chaos, urgency, and despair. I knew that the era of American involvement in Vietnam had come to an end. It was not a triumph, but a necessary conclusion, and delay would have exacted an even greater toll on the international stage. I had to maintain a delicate relationship with the Soviet Union. The Cold War was an unseen tug-of-war, where every diplomatic move, every statement, could trigger a chain reaction. We worked to continue strategic arms limitation negotiations, aiming to reduce nuclear risks. I understood that true peace could not come overnight, but we had to take steps forward. I spent countless late nights with Kissinger reviewing global hotspots, from the Middle East to Europe, from Asia to the Pacific, studying every potential flashpoint, knowing that any miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. I often reminded my team, caution is harder than boldness, but it is far more important. Domestically, the relationship between Congress and the presidency was tense. Watergate had left lawmakers deeply wary of executive power, and no matter what proposals I presented, they scrutinized and sometimes obstructed them. I understood their distrust. Having served in Congress for many years, I knew that legislators needed to assert their independence after such a historical breach. Yet as president, I had to balance cooperation with principle. I used my veto power more than any previous president, not to pick fights, but because I believed some legislation threatened the nation's long-term stability. I could not compromise the country's future to win popularity. I knew these decisions would lower my approval ratings and cost me politically, but I was willing to bear that because the nation's interest came first. Social pressures were immense as well. America was still dealing with the aftershocks of the civil rights movement. Tensions across race and class persisted. Education, housing, and employment inequalities were constant sources of friction. I worked to uphold fairness, supported enforcement actions against injustice, and promoted civil rights policies where I could. Some thought I was too cautious. Others thought I was too interventionist. But I always believed that a president's role is not to inflame division, but to find ways to help the nation heal, slowly and steadily. During the darkest moments, I often walked down the White House hallways late at night, heading outdoors into the quiet. The night wind would blow, and I could hear my own breath, and with it, I heard the question I asked myself repeatedly. Did you do enough today? Did you fulfill your duty? Did you stay true to your conscience? I can't say I always answered yes, but I always tried to be honest. I never hid the difficulties, never shifted responsibility. I believe the American people deserved respect and the truth that I knew my presidency would not be glamorous and my decisions would not please everyone. But America needed a steady hand more than a grand spectacle, and I tried to provide just that. I stayed transparent, steadfast, and principled. My aim was not to be remembered for glory, but to help the nation regain its footing after a period of lost trust. Looking back, I see that period as a necessary journey, difficult but essential. It lacked dramatic victories, but it was filled with responsibility, struggle, and perseverance. I learned that leadership is not about raising your voice the loudest, but about keeping the course even in the darkest hours. Some things require time, some policies take years to show results, and some decisions are misunderstood in the present but prove valuable in the future. I was willing to endure misunderstanding, willing to pay the cost, because I believed America's future was worth every effort. This is the chapter of my life that shows the pressures I faced as president, the choices I made, and the inner resolve I carried. Those days were heavy, complex, but they were real, and they prepared me to continue serving a nation that depended on steadiness and integrity. When I reflect on my years at Yale, I see them as a critical bridge between the discipline of my earlier life and the public service I was destined to pursue. Arriving in New Haven, I was conscious of the weight of expectation, my own, my family's, and the standards I had set for myself. Yale was intimidating in ways Grand Rapids and Michigan never had been. The campus was vast, steeped in history, and filled with students who were as brilliant as they were ambitious. I was determined not just to keep up, but to learn everything I could, to prepare myself for the responsibilities I knew I would one day bear. Academically, I was rigorous. Law school demanded attention to detail, the ability to analyze complex arguments, and a thorough understanding of precedent and principle. I spent hours poring over legal texts, case studies, and statutes, often well into the night. There were moments when the work felt overwhelming, when the breadth of what I had to master seemed impossible. Yet I reminded myself that every hour spent studying was an investment not only in a career, but in the kind of service I wanted to render to the country. Knowledge, after all, is the foundation of sound judgment. Outside the classroom, I continued my connection to athletics and mentorship. I coached football, working with younger players who looked to me for guidance and example. Teaching was never just a job, it was a responsibility. Every practice, every drill, every conversation was an opportunity to instill values, discipline, integrity, teamwork, and resilience. Watching young men develop both their skill and their character was profoundly rewarding. I saw parallels between the lessons learned on the field and those necessary in life and public service. Persistence, accountability, and respect for others. Yale also exposed me to a network of ideas and people that shaped my perspective on leadership and governance. I engaged in discussions on government structure, constitutional law, and civil liberties, often debating classmates who would later become leaders in their own right. These debates were not merely academic. They were exercises in empathy, logic, and compromise. I learned to consider multiple perspectives, to anticipate counterarguments, and to balance principle with pragmatism. That training would prove invaluable when navigating the contentious political arenas I would later face. Financially, Yale presented challenges as well. I continued to work part-time, tutoring, assisting with research, and taking on any opportunity to support myself through school. These responsibilities reminded me of the value of hard work and the importance of managing one's resources wisely. Every dollar earned, every hour worked, reinforced lessons of perseverance and responsibility that had been instilled in me since childhood. During this period, I also began to think more seriously about the kind of public service I wished to pursue. The law offered a framework for justice, a structure through which one could influence society constructively. But I knew that mere technical knowledge was not enough. Leadership required character, moral clarity, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. My experiences at Yale, both in and out of the classroom, were forging that character, sharpening my judgment, and preparing me for the challenges ahead. That I recall late nights in the library, reading cases that seemed remote or abstract at first glance, only to realize their profound impact on real people's lives. I understood that laws were not just words on paper. They were instruments that shaped society, for better or worse. That awareness instilled in me a sense of humility. The decisions I would make as a lawyer and later as a legislator and president could affect countless lives. I vowed to approach every decision with diligence, integrity, and empathy. Beyond academics and athletics, Yale offered lessons in human connection. I met people from every corner of the country and from diverse backgrounds, each bringing their own experiences, challenges, and aspirations. Learning to listen, to engage respectfully with different perspectives, and to build relationships across divides became as important as mastering the law. These interactions deepened my understanding of the country I would one day serve and reinforced the notion that leadership is fundamentally about serving others. During these years, I also faced personal growth in ways both subtle and profound. Living away from home, managing demanding responsibilities, and navigating new social and intellectual environments forced me to confront my own limitations and develop resilience. There were setbacks, failed arguments, moments of self-doubt, and the occasional exhaustion that comes from pushing oneself too hard. But each challenge was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prepare for the next stage of life. That I maintained a commitment to public service even while pursuing personal and professional development. I volunteered for local initiatives, engaged in community programs, and sought ways to contribute meaningfully to the lives of those around me. I recognized that service was not something reserved for those in high office. It was a principle to live by, a habit of action, and a measure of one's character. By the time I graduated, I had a clearer sense of purpose. Yale had provided me not only with legal training, but with a framework for understanding the complexities of society and governance. It had taught me patience, discipline, and the importance of thoughtful decision-making. It had reinforced lessons of integrity, fairness, and empathy that would guide every step of my public life. Looking back, I see those Yale years as a period of intense preparation, a crucible in which the values, skills, and resilience that would define my career were forged. The challenges were many, but each one strengthened my resolve. I emerged not just as a law graduate, but as someone ready to serve, to lead with honesty, and to face the pressures of public life with measured judgment. Those years instilled in me a lifelong commitment to approach every responsibility with diligence, every challenge with courage, and every decision with integrity. Yale taught me that knowledge alone does not make a leader. Character, judgment, and the ability to serve others are what truly define one's impact. And those lessons, learned in lecture halls, libraries, and football fields, would stay with me throughout my journey, from Congress to the vice presidency, and eventually to the Oval Office. After graduating from Yale, I faced a pivotal moment in my life. I had the legal training, the discipline, and a growing sense of responsibility, but I needed to decide how best to serve my country. The world was changing rapidly. Europe was still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Asia was in flux, and the Cold War was tightening its grip on international affairs. I knew that my next steps would define not just my own life, but my ability to make a meaningful contribution to the nation. That I joined the Navy shortly after graduation. Serving my country in uniform was not something I took lightly. It was a continuation of the sense of duty instilled in me by my parents, by my early experiences on the football field, and by the mentors who had guided me. The Navy demanded a different kind of discipline than football or law school. The stakes were immediate, tangible, and sometimes dangerous. I learned to navigate complex hierarchies, to work as part of a team where mistakes could have severe consequences, and to make decisions with clarity and speed. Every day in uniform reinforced lessons of responsibility, humility, and the importance of serving a cause larger than oneself, and why time in the Navy also exposed me to people from all walks of life. I met young men and women with extraordinary courage and ordinary concerns. I saw acts of heroism and moments of fear. I observed leadership at every level, from commanding officers making strategic decisions to junior sailors quietly performing essential tasks. Those experiences shaped my understanding of service. Leadership is not about recognition. It is about reliability, integrity, and the willingness to bear the burden for others. I carried those lessons with me long after I returned to civilian life. After my service, I returned to Grand Rapids, to my family and my community. I began practicing law and quickly became involved in local civic affairs. Working in the community reminded me of the everyday challenges that people face, issues of housing, employment, fairness, and opportunity. I realized that effective leadership requires an understanding of these challenges, not just from a policy perspective, but from a human one. You cannot legislate without empathy, and you cannot lead without listening. It was during this period that I became interested in running for public office. I had watched the nation grapple with economic challenges, global conflicts, and social change. I had seen firsthand the impact of legislation, both good and bad, on ordinary citizens. I understood that government could be a force for stability and fairness, but only if those who held office were guided by principle rather than ambition alone. I decided to run for Congress because I believed I could contribute to that stability, and because I felt a personal responsibility to serve. Campaigning was unlike anything I had experienced before. It required long hours, careful planning, and the ability to connect with people from diverse backgrounds. I knocked on doors, attended countless community meetings, and spoke to groups of every size. The goal was simple: to listen, to understand, and to convey my belief that public service was a sacred responsibility. Politics is often painted as a game of strategy and persuasion, but I approached it differently. I saw it as an opportunity to build trust, to create understanding, and to help shape policies that would have real, lasting impact. Winning the election was both a relief and a beginning. It was relief because the campaign had been exhausting and filled with uncertainty. It was a beginning because holding office meant that I now had a direct responsibility to represent my constituents, to legislate wisely, and to act with integrity in every decision. I entered Congress with a strong sense of humility and a commitment to do my best, understanding that every vote, every speech, and every negotiation could affect the lives of thousands. My early years in Congress were challenging. Navigating committees, understanding complex legislation, and balancing competing interests required patience, careful listening, and thoughtful analysis. I quickly realized that compromise is not a weakness. It is a necessity in a functioning democracy. One must hold fast to principle, but also find common ground when possible. Leadership is often about finding that delicate balance, and I learned it the hard way, through trial, error, and reflection. I also came to understand the importance of personal character in politics. People watch not just what you do, but how you do it. Integrity, honesty, and consistency are essential. Constituents place trust in their representatives, and that trust is fragile. Once broken, it is almost impossible to regain. I made a conscious decision early on to be transparent, to admit mistakes when they occurred, and to always strive to act in the public interest rather than for personal gain. These choices shaped my reputation, guided my actions, and provided a foundation for the challenges that lay ahead. During this period, I also learned to navigate the pressures of public scrutiny. Being in Congress meant constant attention from the press, from political opponents, and from constituents. Every decision was examined, every word analyzed. It could have been overwhelming, but I focused on the core principle that guided me: serve with honesty, act with integrity, and let the work speak for itself. Public opinion can be fickle, but the satisfaction of knowing that you are striving to do right by your community and your country provides its own reward. As I became more experienced, I began to take on greater responsibilities. I served on key committees, worked on legislation affecting national and international issues, and participated in debates that required careful judgment and steady leadership. Each challenge reinforced the lessons I had learned throughout my life, that preparation, patience, and persistence are essential, that listening is as important as speaking, and that leadership is most effective when it is guided by principle rather than ambition. Looking back on that time, I see a period of growth, learning, and preparation. The Navy taught me discipline and service, my legal work taught me analysis and fairness, and Congress taught me negotiation, responsibility, and the weight of public trust. All of these experiences were preparing me for the greater challenges to come. They reinforced the belief that leadership is not about personal glory, but about service, integrity, and the steady application of judgment in the face of complexity. Those years defined my approach to public life. I learned that every decision matters, every action has consequences, and every choice must be guided by principle. I also learned that perseverance, humility, and a commitment to service are far more valuable than recognition or praise. These lessons became the foundation of my career, shaping not just my actions in Congress, but the way I approached every challenge in life and, ultimately, in the presidency. Stepping into the presidency was unlike anything I had experienced before. I did not arrive there through a traditional election victory, but rather in the aftermath of a national crisis, when the trust of the American people in their leaders had been deeply shaken. From the very first day, I knew my foremost responsibility was to restore confidence, not only in the presidency itself, but in the ability of government to act with integrity, fairness, and purpose. Every decision I made would be scrutinized, every statement analyzed, and every action questioned. That weight was constant, but it strengthened my resolve to serve faithfully. One of the earliest and most controversial decisions I faced was the pardon of Richard Nixon. I understood immediately the personal and political risks involved. Many people believed justice demanded prosecution, and they feared that a pardon would undermine accountability. I spent long hours deliberating with advisors, weighing not just legal precedent, but the broader needs of the country. The nation had endured months of scandal, tension, and division. Prolonging the process would only deepen the wound. I came to believe that granting the pardon, though personally unpopular, was necessary to allow the country to heal and to restore focus on governing effectively. I knew the criticism would be intense, yet the decision reflected my guiding principle, that leadership requires courage and the willingness to act in the national interest, even under scrutiny. Economically, the challenges were immense. Inflation was rising, unemployment remained troubling, and public confidence in the economy was fragile. I worked closely with my advisors to develop policies aimed at controlling inflation, stabilizing growth, and promoting fiscal responsibility. Each decision carried trade-offs. Raising interest rates could slow inflation but risked suppressing economic growth. Budgetary adjustments could provide short-term relief but affect the deficit long-term. Every measure required careful calculation, and every message to the public had to communicate both reasoning and reassurance. I realized that leadership is not simply about making decisions. It is about ensuring that those decisions are thoughtful, transparent, and grounded in the best interests of the nation. Working with Congress was equally challenging. I had no electoral mandate and faced skepticism from many members. Passing legislation required negotiation, patience, and compromise, yet I remained committed to principle. I spent countless hours building relationships across the aisle, listening to concerns, and identifying areas of agreement. At the same time, I maintained my integrity, refusing to sacrifice core values for political expediency. I learned that effective governance depends as much on trust and consistency as on policy proposals. Leadership is not about imposing one's will, but about guiding the nation responsibly, even when doing so requires quiet perseverance and thoughtful diplomacy within the political process. Foreign affairs demanded constant attention. The Cold War created a backdrop of tension that influenced every interaction with allies and adversaries. I focused on maintaining strategic stability, pursuing diplomacy with care, and reducing the risk of escalation. Conflicts in other regions, including the Middle East and Asia, required thoughtful engagement and measured response. I spent hours reviewing intelligence, consulting advisors, and weighing the consequences of potential actions. Each decision had far-reaching implications, and miscalculation could have dire consequences. I learned that leadership on the international stage requires patience, foresight, and the ability to act decisively while maintaining the nation's credibility and security. At home, domestic social challenges were still pressing. Questions of civil rights, economic opportunity, and public trust in government demanded attention. I supported policies designed to promote fairness, stability, and inclusion, while being careful to avoid reactionary measures that might deepen division or create unintended consequences. Leadership required a balance between courage and restraint, knowing when to act decisively and when to step back, observe, and guide policy thoughtfully. I constantly reminded myself that sustainable progress comes from steady, principled action, not impulsive measures or symbolic gestures. Public scrutiny was relentless. Every action, every word, every policy decision was dissected in the press and debated by political opponents. I understood that leadership is not about seeking approval, but about acting with integrity and in the best interest of the nation. Popularity is fleeting, but principled service has lasting value. Even when criticized, I remained focused on fulfilling my duties with diligence, thoughtfulness, and transparency. That approach guided my decisions from the economic sphere to foreign policy and social governance. Reflecting on those months, I recognized that the presidency is a role that isolates, challenges, and tests every aspect of one's character. Decisions must be made with incomplete information, under immense pressure, and with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. I relied on the values instilled in me throughout my life: honesty, integrity, discipline, and service to guide me through the complexity. Leadership is not about personal gain. It is about shouldering responsibility, weighing options carefully, and acting for the greater good, even when doing so invites criticism or misunderstanding. Every challenge, whether managing the economy, negotiating with Congress, addressing social tensions, or engaging in foreign diplomacy, reinforced the principles I had long held. Leadership is less about immediate victories and more about the consistent exercise of judgment, the application of integrity, and the perseverance to face criticism while making decisions that benefit the nation. My actions during this time were guided by the conviction that the presidency is a trust, one that demands careful stewardship, moral clarity, and a steadfast commitment to the American people. Looking back, I see those months as a period of extraordinary responsibility, intense learning, and personal growth. The weight of decisions, the scrutiny of the public, and the pressures of office were constant, yet they strengthened my resolve to serve faithfully. I learned that the measure of a leader is not applause or recognition, but the courage to act with integrity, the patience to deliberate wisely, and the dedication to serve the nation above self. These lessons remain my guide not only through the remainder of my presidency, but throughout my life, shaping every choice, every responsibility, and every opportunity to serve. As my presidency progressed into its later stages, I became increasingly conscious of the delicate balance required to lead a nation still recovering from scandal and division. Every action I took, every statement I made, was under scrutiny, and I knew that the public's trust was fragile. Restoring confidence in the office and in the government itself was a constant priority. I reminded myself daily that leadership is not measured by applause or immediate approval, but by the ability to act with integrity, consistency, and purpose, even when that invites criticism or misunderstanding. Economically, the challenges remained pressing. Inflation continued to strain families, unemployment lingered as a concern, and Americans were anxious about the future. I devoted countless hours to reviewing reports, meeting with economic advisors, and analyzing the consequences of potential policies. Every decision carried trade-offs. Adjusting interest rates could slow inflation but risked curbing growth. Budgetary measures might relieve one problem while creating challenges elsewhere. Communicating these decisions clearly to the public was as important as the decisions themselves. People needed to understand not only what was being done, but why it was necessary. I realized that effective leadership demands both careful calculation and the patience to allow policies to take effect, even when immediate results are uncertain. Working with Congress was a continual test of patience and diplomacy. Without a personal electoral mandate, I had to cultivate relationships, build trust, and negotiate compromises, all while remaining committed to principle. I spent hours engaging with members from both parties, listening to concerns, finding common ground, and pursuing legislation that could improve the nation's well-being. I learned that successful governance relies as much on personal integrity, consistency, and respect as it does on policy expertise. Quiet persistence, thoughtful negotiation, and a commitment to service often achieve more than grand gestures or attempts to dominate political discourse. Foreign policy presented its own set of complex challenges. The Cold War remained a defining backdrop, and every decision carried strategic implications. I focused on maintaining stability with the Soviet Union through careful diplomacy, while monitoring developments in other regions that could affect national security. Conflicts in the Middle East, political shifts in Asia, and global economic fluctuations required constant attention. I spent long hours reviewing intelligence, consulting with advisors, and planning measured responses that would protect American interests without escalating tensions unnecessarily. These experiences reinforced my understanding that leadership on the international stage requires foresight, patience, and the courage to act decisively when circumstances demand it. Domestically, social issues remained significant. The nation continued to grapple with questions of civil rights, economic equality, and public trust in institutions. I sought to support policies that promoted fairness, opportunity, and stability, while carefully avoiding measures that might deepen divisions or provoke unintended consequences. Leadership required both courage to act when necessary and restraint to prevent rash decisions. I reminded myself constantly that meaningful progress comes from steady, principled action, not from symbolic gestures or impulsive moves designed for immediate approval. Throughout these months, the pressure of public scrutiny was constant. Every word, every decision, every policy choice was analyzed by the press, debated by political opponents, and scrutinized by the public. I learned that leadership is not about seeking validation, but about acting responsibly, guided by principle and focused on the nation's best interest. Even when misunderstood or criticized, I drew strength from the knowledge that my decisions were deliberate, considered, and rooted in a commitment to service. That I often spent late nights reflecting on the nature of leadership and the responsibilities of the presidency. Decisions were rarely straightforward, and the consequences of misjudgment could be profound. I relied on the values that had guided me throughout my life: honesty, integrity, discipline, and dedication to service, to navigate the complexity of the office. I reminded myself that the presidency is not about personal gain or acclaim, but about shouldering responsibility, exercising sound judgment, and acting in the nation's interest above all else. Every challenge, whether economic, legislative, social, or diplomatic, taught me valuable lessons about perseverance, judgment, and the exercise of principled leadership. I realized that true leadership is often quiet, deliberate, and steady rather than dramatic or sensational. It requires the courage to make unpopular choices when necessary, the wisdom to listen and adapt, and the humility to recognize the weight of the office and the trust placed in it by the American people. Looking back on this period, I see a time of extraordinary responsibility, growth, and reflection. The decisions I made were not always easy, and the pressures were immense, but they reinforced my commitment to serving the nation faithfully. I came to understand that the measure of a leader is not in accolades or fleeting popularity, but in the integrity of action, the careful application of judgment, and the dedication to the long-term well-being of the country. Even amidst criticism and scrutiny, I found purpose and resolve in knowing that I was striving to uphold the trust and confidence of the American people. These months taught me that leadership is both a privilege and a burden. It demands constant attention, steadfast principles, and the willingness to bear responsibility for decisions that affect millions. It requires patience, courage, and the consistent application of values learned over a lifetime. Serving as president during such a complex and turbulent period reinforced for me the enduring importance of honesty, integrity, perseverance, and service. These principles guided me through every challenge, every decision, and every reflection, shaping the way I approached leadership and the nation's trust during those critical months. As I approached the final stretch of my presidency, the weight of responsibility was ever present. Every decision I made, every action I took, seemed amplified by the scrutiny of a nation still deeply attuned to the office of the president. I understood that the trust of the American people was fragile and had to be honored with unwavering integrity. Leadership, I realized, is measured not by applause or fleeting approval, but by the steady, principled exercise of judgment, the ability to act decisively, and the commitment to the long-term welfare of the country. Economic challenges persisted as a central concern. Inflation had begun to moderate, but the impact of previous economic instability continued to affect families and businesses across the nation. I devoted countless hours to reviewing policy proposals, consulting with advisors, and weighing the potential outcomes of each decision. Measures intended to stabilize the economy had to be balanced carefully against growth, employment, and public confidence. Every action required meticulous thought, clear communication, and the patience to allow policies to take effect. I understood that leadership involves not just making decisions, but ensuring they are understood and trusted by those affected. Congress remained a complicated arena in which to govern effectively. I had to navigate a legislature that was often skeptical, cautious, and divided. Success required careful negotiation, building trust, and seeking compromise without compromising principle. I spent long hours in meetings, discussions, and debates, working to advance legislation that would benefit the nation while maintaining the integrity of the office. I learned that leadership is as much about relationships, trust, and consistency as it is about policy expertise. Quiet diligence, thoughtful engagement, and principled persistence often accomplish more than dramatic gestures or political theater. Foreign policy continued to demand constant vigilance. The Cold War was ongoing, and strategic stability required both careful diplomacy and calculated prudence. I monitored international developments closely, consulting advisors and reviewing intelligence to ensure that the United States maintained its security, credibility, and influence. Regional conflicts, shifting alliances, and global economic trends required measured responses that balanced immediate pressures with long-term strategy. I realized that leadership on the international stage requires foresight, steady judgment, and the courage to act decisively when circumstances demand, while remaining mindful of potential consequences. Domestic social concerns also required thoughtful attention. Questions surrounding civil rights, economic equality, and public trust in institutions persisted. I sought to support policies that promoted fairness, opportunity, and stability while avoiding decisions that could exacerbate divisions or create unintended consequences. Leadership required both courage and restraint, knowing when to act decisively and when to exercise patience. I understood that meaningful progress comes from steady, deliberate action, guided by principle and a long-term vision for the nation. Public scrutiny remained constant, and the pressures of the office were relentless. Every decision was analyzed, debated, and critiqued. I learned that leadership is not about seeking approval or praise. It is about making decisions responsibly, ethically, and in the best interest of the nation. Even in the face of misunderstanding or criticism, I drew strength from the conviction that my actions were thoughtful, deliberate, and guided by principle. Late nights and long hours were spent reflecting on the responsibilities I had borne, the decisions I had made, and the lessons I had learned. I contemplated the nature of leadership, the demands of public service, and the importance of character, integrity, and judgment. I recognized that the presidency is both a privilege and a profound responsibility, requiring the ability to weigh competing pressures, make difficult decisions, and act with both prudence and courage. Through these final months, I came to understand that leadership is rarely about personal recognition or immediate results. True leadership is demonstrated by perseverance, consistency, and the commitment to act in the nation's best interest, even when the path is difficult or unpopular. Every challenge, whether economic, legislative, social, or diplomatic, was an opportunity to exercise judgment, uphold principle, and serve the American people with integrity. Looking back on this period, I see it as a time of reflection, growth, and steadfast dedication to service. The pressures were immense, the decisions complex, and the scrutiny unrelenting, yet they reinforced the values that guided me throughout my life: honesty, diligence, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to the public good. I understood that the measure of leadership is not in applause or recognition, but in the courage to act ethically, the persistence to navigate challenges wisely, and the dedication to leave the nation stronger and more confident in its future. As I prepared to conclude my term, I reflected on the lessons learned, the responsibilities honored, and the trust placed in me by the American people. Leadership is both a privilege and a duty, requiring constant attention, moral clarity, and an enduring focus on the greater good. These final months crystallized for me the essence of service: to act with principle, to persevere with integrity, and to guide the nation faithfully through both challenge and opportunity. The experience reaffirmed that the presidency is not a pursuit of power, but a solemn responsibility, and that true leadership is measured by the commitment to serve others above self. As I entered the final months of my presidency, I was keenly aware of the immense responsibility that had been entrusted to me and the complex challenges that remained. Each day brought a new set of decisions, and every action carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. I reflected often on the delicate balance between leadership and public expectation, between principle and pragmatism, and between immediate action and long-term impact. The office demanded not only strategic thinking and decisiveness, but also patience, humility, and steadfast commitment to service. One of the ongoing challenges was maintaining economic stability. Inflation continued to influence daily life for millions of Americans, and the pressure to act decisively was constant. I worked closely with my advisors to evaluate policy options, including fiscal measures, interest rate adjustments, and budget priorities. Every step had trade-offs. Policies that might reduce inflation could slow economic growth, while measures aimed at stimulating employment could affect the deficit. Communicating these complex choices to the public required clarity and honesty, ensuring that Americans understood both the necessity and the reasoning behind each action. I learned that leadership involves not only making difficult decisions, but also explaining them in ways that build trust and understanding. Congress remained an arena of constant negotiation and careful strategy. Without a direct mandate from a national election, I had to navigate a legislature that was often cautious or skeptical of my presidency. Building relationships, engaging in constructive dialogue, and finding areas of compromise were essential to advancing policies that served the nation. At the same time, I remained committed to principle, refusing to sacrifice integrity for political expediency. I discovered that success in governance is rarely about unilateral action. It is about persistence, trust, and the ability to reconcile competing interests while remaining faithful to core values. Foreign affairs demanded careful attention as well. The Cold War continued to shape international relations, requiring vigilance, prudence, and diplomacy. Maintaining strategic stability with the Soviet Union, addressing regional conflicts, and responding to global political shifts demanded long hours of briefings, analysis, and consultation. I learned that effective leadership on the global stage requires foresight, measured judgment, and the ability to act decisively when circumstances demand it, all while keeping the nation's long-term security and reputation in mind. Domestically, social issues and public expectations created additional pressures. Questions of civil rights, economic opportunity, and institutional trust required thoughtful engagement. I worked to support policies that promoted fairness, stability, and opportunity, while carefully avoiding actions that might inflame tensions or create unintended consequences. Leadership demanded both courage and restraint, knowing when to act decisively, and when patience and careful consideration were the wiser course. I found that sustainable progress comes not from reactionary measures, but from steady, principled effort and careful guidance. Throughout these months, I was reminded repeatedly of the weight of public scrutiny. Every speech, every decision, every policy was analyzed and debated, often by critics who questioned motives or effectiveness. I came to understand that leadership is not about seeking approval, but about consistently acting in the best interests of the nation, guided by principle, integrity, and a commitment to public service. Even amidst criticism, I found purpose in knowing that my actions were deliberate, thoughtful, and designed to uphold the trust placed in me by the American people. Late nights were often spent reflecting on the lessons learned from the months and years in office. I thought deeply about the nature of leadership, the responsibilities inherent in the presidency, and the enduring importance of integrity, honesty, and diligence. I understood that the office is both a privilege and a profound responsibility, requiring the ability to bear criticism, to weigh competing pressures, and to act decisively with the nation's best interest at heart. Leadership is not measured by fleeting popularity or accolades, but by the courage to act ethically, the perseverance to navigate complex challenges, and the dedication to serve faithfully. As my time in the White House drew to a close, I considered the legacy of my decisions and the lessons they had taught me. I realized that leadership requires more than strategy or political skill. It requires character, judgment, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that guide a nation. Every challenge, economic, political, social, or diplomatic, offered an opportunity to exercise these principles, to act with integrity, and to demonstrate that public service is both a responsibility and an honor. Looking back, I see these final months as a period of reflection, responsibility, and personal growth. The pressures of the office, the complexity of decisions, and the scrutiny of the public were constant companions, yet they reinforced the essential lessons of leadership: patience, integrity, diligence, and service. I understood that the measure of a president is not in the ease of office or the popularity of decisions, but in the consistent application of principle, the courage to act decisively, and the commitment to leave the nation stronger, more stable, and more confident in its future. Even as I prepared to transition the office to my successor, I remained guided by the same values that had carried me through every challenge: honesty, prudence, responsibility, and service above self. These months solidified my understanding of leadership not as a pursuit of power, but as a stewardship of trust, a responsibility to the people, and a commitment to guiding the nation with wisdom, courage, and integrity. The lessons learned in these final months of office remain with me, shaping my reflections, my actions, and my understanding of what it truly means to serve as President of the United States. When the Watergate scandal began to unfold, I could feel the tension in the air even from a distance. The nation was watching, and the political world had suddenly shifted from routine governance to a crisis of trust. It all started with the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, seemingly a small and isolated event, but it soon became clear that it was connected to forces operating at the highest levels of government. The appointment of a special prosecutor signaled the seriousness of the investigation. His mandate was clear: uncover the truth, no matter where it led. From that moment, I understood that the presidency, the very institution I had respected, was facing its sternest test in decades. The special prosecutor pursued the investigation with relentless focus. Every witness, every document, every piece of evidence was scrutinized. The White House, which had always seemed impervious, suddenly appeared vulnerable. Conversations behind closed doors, internal memos, and strategic communications, all were now subject to examination. The sense of scrutiny was immense. The political and public arenas alike were electrified with speculation, fear, and anticipation. I remember thinking repeatedly about the fragility of public trust. Once shaken, it could unravel rapidly, and indeed, it did. The American people, the press, and political observers were all focused on one question: would those in power be held accountable? Then came the revelation of the White House tapes. I recall the moment when it became publicly known that conversations inside the Oval Office had been recorded, a discovery that altered the course of the investigation entirely. These tapes, painstakingly detailed, revealed conversations and deliberations that some might have hoped would remain private. Suddenly, there was incontrovertible evidence of internal discussions that confirmed suspicions of wrongdoing. The legal battles over the release of these tapes dominated headlines, courtrooms, and the national conversation. Each subpoena and each judicial ruling was a step forward in the pursuit of transparency, yet it also deepened the crisis of confidence surrounding the presidency. As the tapes were gradually released, the American people were exposed to the inner workings of the White House like never before. Citizens listened as the voices of their leaders discussed strategy, obstruction, and political maneuvering. What might have once been invisible to the public was now laid bare, and the consequences were profound. Public trust, once taken for granted, eroded swiftly. Opinion polls reflected a nation grappling with betrayal, anger, and disappointment. Leaders across the political spectrum began to acknowledge that the credibility of the presidency itself had been compromised. There was no turning back. The scandal had reached a point of no return. Throughout this period, I observed the interplay of law, politics, and public sentiment with growing intensity. The special prosecutor's work exemplified the principle that no one is above the law, not even the president. Investigations revealed attempts to influence outcomes, cover up misdeeds, and manipulate the political system. These revelations shocked the nation and fundamentally altered how Americans perceive their government. The media, serving as both watchdog and informer, amplified each development, bringing Watergate into living rooms across the country, making the crisis intensely personal for every citizen. As the summer of 1974 approached, it became increasingly apparent that the president's position was untenable. Congressional hearings, public protests, and mounting legal evidence painted a clear picture. The office had been compromised, and the confidence of the nation could no longer be assumed. Advisors, colleagues, and political leaders alike recognized that the only path forward that could preserve some measure of institutional integrity was resignation. The weight of history pressed heavily upon the moment. When the announcement came, it was not merely a political act. It was a historic moment, unprecedented in its implications for American democracy. Reflecting on the unfolding of Watergate, it is evident that the crisis was as much about principle as it was about politics. The pursuit of accountability, the exposure of hidden wrongdoing, and the steadfast adherence to rule of law underscored the resilience of American institutions. Trust, once lost, takes years to rebuild, yet the episode reinforced the essential lesson that the presidency is a role of immense responsibility, bound by law, ethics, and public expectation. The resignation of a sitting president was a dramatic reminder that no office, no matter how powerful, is beyond oversight or accountability. The impact of Watergate extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. It reshaped the relationship between the American people and their leaders, redefining expectations for transparency, ethical behavior, and the exercise of power. Citizens, now more vigilant, demanded higher standards from those in office. Political institutions were reminded that their legitimacy derives from adherence to law and principle, not simply from authority or tradition. The legacy of this period was not merely the downfall of a single individual, but the affirmation of democratic accountability and the enduring capacity of the nation to correct its course in times of crisis. Looking back, the lessons of Watergate remain vivid. I see a nation challenged, tested, and ultimately resilient. I see the crucial role of investigative diligence, legal oversight, and journalistic courage in preserving the integrity of governance. Most importantly, I see a reminder that public trust is the most precious commodity a leader can hold, and that leadership demands not only skill and vision, but unwavering adherence to principle, transparency, and responsibility. Watergate was a moment of reckoning, a demonstration that accountability is fundamental to democracy, and a testament to the enduring strength of American institutions even under the greatest stress. When I assumed the presidency after Nixon's resignation, I was immediately confronted with a decision that I knew would define my time in office and shape my legacy, whether or not to grant a pardon to Richard Nixon. From the very first moments I considered it, I felt the weight of history pressing upon me. I understood that this was not a decision to be taken lightly, nor one that would be universally accepted. It was a decision that required reflection, moral clarity, and an unwavering focus on the greater good of the nation. The inner struggle was profound. On one hand, there was the undeniable legal and moral expectation that wrongdoing should be punished. On the other hand, the country had endured months of political scandal, public distrust, and national distraction. Continuing legal proceedings against Nixon could have prolonged the division and further undermined the stability of our government. I spent countless hours discussing the matter with advisors, weighing the legal implications, and considering the potential consequences for public trust. Each argument, each perspective, deepened my understanding of the magnitude of the choice before me. Ultimately, my decision to grant a full and unconditional pardon was guided by what I believed to be the best interest of the nation. I realized that the country needed closure. We could not remain mired indefinitely in legal proceedings that would consume attention, drain resources, and continue to erode public confidence. My reasoning was not about protecting an individual, nor about shielding anyone from accountability in a moral sense. It was about allowing the nation to heal, to move forward, and to regain focus on governance and unity. The burden of that choice rested heavily on me, but I was convinced that it was necessary for the stability of our democracy. The reaction to the pardon was immediate and intense. Nationwide, people expressed both anger and support. Many saw the pardon as an affront to justice, a symbol that those in power were above the law. I received criticism from newspapers, public figures, and citizens alike. Protests erupted, and the sentiment of outrage was palpable. Yet, even amid the fury, some understood the rationale behind my decision. They recognized that prolonged trials and investigations could have paralyzed the government and deepened the fractures within American society. Leadership often requires making decisions that are unpopular in the short term but necessary for the long-term health of the nation. That I recall vividly the personal cost of that decision. It was a time of isolation, reflection, and occasional doubt. There were moments when I questioned whether I had made the right choice, whether I could withstand the backlash, and whether history would judge me fairly. But I reminded myself repeatedly that leadership is not about immediate approval or popularity. Leadership is about courage. The courage to make a difficult decision when it is in the best interest of the country, even if doing so invites criticism, misunderstanding, or hostility. In the quiet moments of reflection, I found reassurance in the principle that guided me, that the presidency is a trust, and that the nation's welfare must come above all else. The pardon ultimately allowed the country to begin a process of recovery. Public attention shifted gradually from scandal to policy, from crisis to governance. While debate and disagreement continued, the decision created space for the nation to focus on pressing domestic and international challenges. I observed carefully as Americans slowly redirected their energy toward rebuilding confidence in their institutions and in the office of the presidency itself. The healing process was neither immediate nor easy, but it had begun. Reflecting on this episode, I understand why the pardon remains one of the most controversial decisions in American history. It tested the limits of presidential authority, moral judgment, and public patience. Yet I remain convinced that, given the circumstances, it was the decision that served the country best. Leadership is not about avoiding controversy. It is about embracing responsibility, weighing consequences carefully, and acting with courage and integrity, even when doing so incurs personal or political cost. In the end, the pardon of Richard Nixon was about more than an individual. It was about preserving the nation, stabilizing the government, and enabling Americans to look forward rather than backward. It taught me the enduring lesson that leadership is a solemn responsibility, that tough decisions often invite criticism, and that serving the greater good sometimes requires personal sacrifice. History may judge that decision in many ways, but I have always believed that it was made in the spirit of healing, integrity, and dedication to the American people. During my presidency, one of the most pressing challenges I faced was the economic crisis that gripped the nation in the mid-1970s. The United States was experiencing a period of stagflation, a combination of high inflation and stagnant economic growth that had profound effects on families, businesses, and the overall confidence of the American people. Prices were rising, unemployment remained a concern, and the energy crisis added further strain. It was clear that addressing these challenges required decisive leadership, careful planning, and a clear message to the nation about the path forward. To confront the economic difficulties, I introduced the WIP Inflation Now, or WIN, program. The goal of WIN was to encourage Americans to take personal responsibility in combating inflation, to save more, spend less, and embrace voluntary measures to help stabilize prices. It was an effort to combine government policy with civic participation to unite the country in addressing the economic challenges. I traveled widely, spoke directly to citizens, and explained that our collective actions, both public and private, could influence the course of the economy. I believe that leadership meant not only policy measures, but also communicating clearly and motivating the nation to act together. The policies I pursued were both fiscal and monetary. I worked with Congress and economic advisors to consider measures that could restrain government spending, encourage investment, and promote confidence in the dollar. We faced difficult choices, adjusting interest rates, controlling budgets, and managing federal programs. all while trying to stimulate growth without exacerbating inflation. I spent countless hours reviewing reports, meeting with economists, and considering the trade-offs inherent in every decision. The complexity of the situation was immense, and I realized that every action had consequences that extended far beyond immediate statistics, affecting the lives of millions of Americans. Despite the intentions behind WIN, the program was met with criticism and skepticism. Some viewed it as symbolic rather than substantive, arguing that voluntary measures could not address systemic economic problems. Others questioned whether government leadership could genuinely influence personal financial behavior. I understood these critiques, and I recognized that no single program could resolve a crisis of this magnitude overnight. However, I remained committed to the principle that leadership requires both action and communication. WIN was not a panacea, but it represented an effort to unite the nation, raise awareness, and encourage responsible behavior alongside practical policy measures. In implementing economic policy, I faced constant scrutiny. The press, Congress, and the public weighed every decision, measuring its effectiveness and consequences. I learned that economic leadership demands not only technical understanding and careful planning, but also the ability to convey vision and purpose. Citizens needed to understand not only the steps being taken, but also the reasoning behind them. Transparency, communication, and moral clarity were as important as any technical measure, because public confidence, is often the currency of economic stability. Reflecting on the WIN program and my broader economic initiatives, I recognize both the successes and the limitations. Inflation began to moderate gradually, and certain fiscal measures helped stabilize aspects of the economy. Yet the challenges of the period underscored the complexity of economic leadership, that results are often delayed, that actions must balance competing priorities, and that the effects of policy are intertwined with public perception and participation. I learned that leadership is rarely about immediate success. It is about persistence, principle, and the steady pursuit of solutions in the face of difficulty. Ultimately, WIN and my economic policies were about more than statistics or short-term results. They were about leadership, responsibility, and the willingness to confront difficult realities with honesty and determination. I understood that guiding the nation through economic turbulence required courage, foresight, and a commitment to both policy and principle. Even when criticized, I remained focused on the long-term goal: restoring confidence, stabilizing the economy, and empowering Americans to act together to overcome challenges. These experiences left an enduring lesson: that leadership in times of economic crisis demands not only technical solutions, but also moral clarity, consistent communication, and the ability to motivate and inspire collective effort. WIN may have faced criticism, but it embodied the principle that effective leadership combines action with engagement, strategy with vision, and policy with public responsibility. The 1970s were a challenging time for the nation, but they reinforced my understanding that perseverance, integrity, and thoughtful leadership are essential to navigating even the most complex economic storms. During my presidency, navigating the complex landscape of the Cold War was one of the most challenging responsibilities I faced. The world was defined by the delicate balance between competition and cooperation with the Soviet Union, and every diplomatic decision carried significant consequences. I understood that the United States needed to engage strategically, to maintain our strength and protect our interests, while also exploring opportunities for easing tensions and preventing escalation. Leadership in this arena demanded both prudence and courage, as well as a keen understanding of international dynamics. One of the most significant milestones during my time in office was the signing of the Helsinki Accords. These agreements, negotiated at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, were intended to promote stability, security, and cooperation across the continent. They represented a delicate balancing act, affirming the existing borders in Europe, promoting peaceful relations among nations, and addressing a range of economic, scientific, and human rights issues. I recognized that this agreement could serve as a framework for reducing tensions between East and West, while simultaneously reinforcing our commitment to democratic principles and human rights. The discussions leading to Helsinki were intense and meticulous. I spent long hours reviewing proposals, consulting with diplomats, and coordinating with our European allies to ensure that the accords would reflect both American interests and international responsibilities. We faced a unique challenge: how to engage with the Soviet Union in a way that promoted cooperation without appearing to compromise on our principles or national security. Every word, every clause, was scrutinized for its potential impact on the delicate balance of power. The process required patience, strategic thinking, and a clear vision of what the United States hoped to achieve. One of the most profound aspects of the Helsinki Accords was the inclusion of human rights commitments. This element went beyond mere diplomacy. It was a statement of values, a reminder that even in negotiations with ideological adversaries, the United States could assert moral leadership. While the enforcement mechanisms were limited, the symbolic importance was enormous. It provided a framework for advocacy, a reference point for citizens behind the Iron Curtain, and a tool for promoting accountability in a world divided by ideology. I understood that integrating human rights into international agreements would be scrutinized, debated, and challenged, but it was essential to our vision of leadership on the global stage. The impact of the Helsinki Accords extended well beyond the negotiations themselves. They shaped international relations, influenced the policies of nations across Europe, and became a benchmark for measuring the sincerity of governments in upholding human rights and peaceful cooperation. For the United States, the accords were a dual achievement. They helped reduce the immediate risk of conflict in Europe while reinforcing our commitment to democratic values. They exemplified the principle that diplomacy is most effective when it balances realism with idealism, when it addresses immediate security concerns while affirming enduring principles. Managing the relationship with the Soviet Union was a constant exercise in careful judgment. Engagement did not mean acquiescence. Cooperation did not mean weakness. I remained vigilant in protecting American interests, maintaining military readiness, and ensuring that our diplomatic efforts were supported by clear strategic objectives. At the same time, I sought to foster dialogue, predict potential crises, and create opportunities for constructive engagement. Leadership during the Cold War required the ability to act decisively in moments of tension, while also cultivating the patience and foresight necessary to sustain long-term stability. Reflecting on these experiences, I recognized that Cold War diplomacy was as much about perception as it was about policy. The American people, our allies, and our adversaries were all watching. Every negotiation, every agreement, every statement was interpreted in light of broader geopolitical considerations. The Helsinki Accords, therefore, were not just a document. They were a demonstration of American leadership, the ability to pursue peace and cooperation without compromising national interests, and a testament to the enduring values that guide our foreign policy. Ultimately, the Accords and my broader approach to U.S.-Soviet relations underscored a central truth. Leadership in international affairs requires balance, clarity of purpose, and the courage to act on principle even amid competing pressures. The world was watching, and every decision contributed to the global perception of American resolve, fairness, and commitment to peace. The Helsinki Accords were a moment in which diplomacy, values, and strategic consideration converged, illustrating the complexity, responsibility, and significance of leadership on the global stage. As the Vietnam War drew to its bitter conclusion, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon my shoulders. Years of conflict, immense human suffering, and political debate culminated in a moment that tested the resolve of our nation and the moral responsibility of the presidency. I had followed the war closely long before my time in office, understanding its complexity and the profound consequences of each decision. Yet, nothing could fully prepare me for the final days of Saigon, when the realities of defeat became impossible to ignore. The evacuation of Saigon was one of the most challenging and heart-wrenching operations I faced. American personnel, along with thousands of South Vietnamese allies, had to be safely transported out of a city on the verge of collapse. The scenes were chaotic, helicopters lifting off from rooftops, crowded airfields, and desperate crowds seeking a way to flee. I witnessed, through briefings and reports, the fear and uncertainty of people whose lives were in immediate danger, and I understood the profound human cost of the war's conclusion. Each decision made in those final hours carried the weight of countless lives, and the responsibility to act decisively was immense that I often reflected on the nature of leadership in such circumstances. Leading a nation through a losing war is perhaps one of the harshest tests a president can face. Every option was fraught with moral and strategic dilemmas. I had to balance the imperative of protecting American lives, honoring our commitments to allies, and upholding the integrity of the United States' international standing. There were no easy answers, and every action, or inaction, was scrutinized with intense public and political focus. I realized that leadership is not measured in victories alone, but also in the courage, judgment, and humanity with which difficult situations are confronted. The end of the war brought with it a period of reflection and reckoning. The images of helicopters lifting off rooftops, the sound of distant gunfire, and the stories of families separated by conflict left an indelible mark on the nation and on me personally. I thought deeply about the lives lost, the sacrifices made, and the lessons that history would demand we learn. It was a moment that underscored the limitations of power, the unpredictability of war, and the profound responsibilities borne by those in command. I understood that my role was not only to respond to immediate crises, but also to help the nation process the consequences of difficult decisions. Managing public perception and national morale during this time was equally challenging. Americans were fatigued by years of conflict, and the fall of Saigon represented both a symbolic and tangible end to a long, divisive chapter. I communicated directly with citizens, acknowledging the pain, expressing sympathy for those affected, and emphasizing the nation's commitment to its values and obligations. Leadership in this context demanded transparency, empathy, and steadiness. I had to guide the country through grief and uncertainty while maintaining faith in the principles that define us as a nation. Reflecting on the conclusion of the Vietnam War, I recognized the enduring lessons it imparted. Leadership is often tested not in moments of triumph, but in moments of crisis and loss. A president must weigh immediate consequences against long-term responsibility, act decisively under intense scrutiny, and strive to protect both human life and the moral integrity of the nation. The evacuation of Saigon was a painful reminder that wars have costs beyond strategy, politics, and victory. It is about people, families, and the human spirit. Every choice carried profound significance, and the consequences of missteps were measured in lives and trust. Ultimately, the end of the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon were defining moments for the presidency, the nation, and for me personally. I learned that true leadership requires courage, compassion, and the capacity to act with integrity even in the face of adversity. There is no simple formula for navigating defeat, but there is an enduring responsibility to act with honesty, humanity, and commitment to the greater good. The experiences of those days, the decisions made, and the lives affected left a lasting imprint, reinforcing the truth that leadership is as much about moral responsibility as it is about political skill or strategic success. Even now, when I reflect on the final days of Saigon, I am reminded that the essence of leadership is not measured solely in victories, but in the steadiness of character, the courage to make difficult choices, and the commitment to serve the nation faithfully in both triumph and trial. The Vietnam War taught lessons that extend far beyond the battlefield, lessons about humanity, responsibility, and the enduring importance of principled leadership in moments of profound national challenge. During my presidency, managing domestic policy presented a landscape of both opportunity and challenge. The nation faced a series of pressing issues: economic pressures, social change, and the need to restore trust in government after a period of profound political upheaval. At the heart of these challenges was the relationship with Congress, particularly a Democratic-controlled legislature that often approached our proposals with skepticism or opposition. Navigating this dynamic required patience, negotiation, and a commitment to principled leadership. I learned quickly that domestic governance, like foreign affairs, demands persistence, clarity, and the ability to find common ground without compromising essential values. One of the early and most controversial actions I took was granting a pardon to those who had evaded the draft during the Vietnam War. This decision, which included a general amnesty for certain categories of draft evaders, was deeply divisive. I understood the emotional and political complexity. Many Americans had suffered loss and sacrifice during the war, and public sentiment was still raw. Yet I also recognized the importance of national reconciliation. Healing the divisions left by the conflict required difficult choices. The pardon was intended not to diminish accountability, but to allow the nation to move forward, to restore unity, and to focus attention on rebuilding trust and addressing ongoing domestic challenges that in addition to matters of reconciliation, reforming our intelligence community was a critical priority. The revelations of prior abuses, coupled with the public's demand for greater oversight, made it clear that our national security apparatus needed both accountability and modernization. I worked with Congress to implement reforms aimed at increasing transparency, strengthening oversight, and preventing abuses of power. These efforts reflected a broader principle that effective governance requires institutions that are both strong and responsible, capable of protecting the nation while respecting the liberties that define our democracy. Navigating the legislative landscape required constant attention to judicial, fiscal, and social issues. I engaged directly with Congress on matters ranging from budgetary priorities to judicial appointments, understanding that each decision could have far-reaching implications. Fiscal responsibility, economic stabilization, and social policy reform were interrelated, and I sought to advance initiatives that would strengthen both the economy and public confidence. The negotiation process was often contentious, and compromise was essential, yet I remained guided by the principle that effective domestic policy must balance pragmatism with ethical leadership and long-term vision. The interplay between policy and politics was ever present. Every initiative, whether it involved amnesty, intelligence reform, or fiscal measures, was scrutinized by the press, the public, and political adversaries. I learned that domestic leadership is not simply about enacting legislation. It is about communicating purpose, building consensus, and ensuring that reforms serve the greater good of the nation. Patience, persistence, and a steady focus on principle became central to navigating the challenges inherent in working with a divided government. Reflecting on these efforts, I see that the domestic agenda during my presidency was a test of leadership, judgment, and resilience. The challenges were complex, bridging partisan divides, addressing lingering social and economic issues, and restoring public confidence in government institutions. Yet they also reinforced fundamental lessons about governance. That leadership requires both courage and collaboration, that ethical responsibility must guide every decision, and that progress often comes incrementally through thoughtful negotiation and steady action. Ultimately, the domestic policies I pursued were aimed at strengthening the nation, protecting liberties, and ensuring that government acted with accountability, integrity, and foresight. From legislative negotiation to reform initiatives, each action was a step toward restoring trust, enhancing institutional effectiveness, and promoting the well-being of all Americans. Leadership in domestic affairs, as I learned, is measured not by immediate applause but by the lasting impact of principled decisions, the resilience of institutions, and the ability to guide the nation thoughtfully through periods of challenge and change. The 1976 presidential election presented one of the most intense challenges of my political life. I had been serving as president during a period of national upheaval, navigating the aftermath of Watergate, economic turbulence, and international crises. Entering the election, I faced a divided nation, an energized opposition, and the formidable task of convincing Americans that I was the right leader for the future. The stakes were enormous, not just for me personally, but for the stability and direction of the country. The primary season began with unexpected intensity. Ronald Reagan emerged as a strong challenger, representing a vibrant and determined conservative movement within the Republican Party. His campaign was energetic, well-organized, and resonated with a segment of the electorate seeking a new direction. Every debate, every primary result, and every public appearance became a test of endurance, judgment, and strategy. I had to balance defending my record as president with responding to his criticisms, all while demonstrating that I remained a capable and trustworthy leader for the nation. During the general election campaign, the contest against Jimmy Carter introduced new complexities. The debates were particularly pivotal, as they provided a platform for candidates to present their vision directly to the American people. One moment, in particular, weighed heavily on my mind: the debate following the Warsaw Pact developments. My response, intended to convey strength and resolve, was perceived by some as hesitant or miscalculated. The scrutiny was intense, and the impact on public perception was significant. It was a reminder that in national campaigns, every word and every nuance is analyzed, often in ways that can dramatically influence voter sentiment. Throughout the campaign, I emphasized my own vision and principles. I spoke about steady leadership, integrity, and the importance of experience in navigating the complex domestic and international challenges facing the nation. I reminded Americans of the work accomplished during my tenure, stabilizing the economy, pursuing peace and diplomacy abroad, and restoring trust in government after Watergate. My message was grounded in the belief that leadership is about responsibility, judgment, and the commitment to serve the nation faithfully, even under difficult circumstances. Despite the dedication and effort, the election outcome reflected a combination of factors. Jimmy Carter's outsider appeal, the desire for a fresh start, and the residual skepticism toward incumbency shaped the political landscape. The campaign was close, hard-fought, and emotionally demanding, yet the nation ultimately chose a different path. I accepted the results with the understanding that in a democracy, leadership requires not only vision and effort, but also respect for the will of the people. The loss, while disappointing, was part of the broader tapestry of public service and civic responsibility. Reflecting on the 1976 election, I recognized the lessons it imparted about politics, leadership, and the nature of public trust. Campaigns are about more than slogans or strategy. They are about connecting with citizens, demonstrating integrity, and articulating a coherent vision for the country. Even in loss, there is insight and growth. Understanding the priorities of the electorate, appreciating the challenges of communication, and acknowledging the broader social and political currents that shape outcomes. The experience reinforced my belief that leadership is defined not solely by victory, but by the steadfast pursuit of principle, the courage to face criticism, and the dedication to serve the nation honestly and faithfully. The campaign demanded resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to act with dignity, even when confronted with setbacks. In the end, public service is measured by commitment and integrity, and every challenge, every election, contributes to the enduring responsibilities of the office. Ultimately, the 1976 election was a defining moment in my life and in the nation's history. It highlighted the challenges of incumbency in a time of transition, the intensity of political competition, and the delicate balance between experience and public perception. I emerged from the campaign with renewed understanding of the complexities of American democracy, the importance of principled leadership, and the enduring responsibility of service to the nation, regardless of the outcome. Leadership, I realized, is as much about character and perseverance as it is about political success, and those lessons remain with me to this day. After leaving the presidency in January 1977, I entered a new chapter of life, one without the daily pressures of executive decision-making, yet still imbued with the responsibility and perspective that come from having led the nation. Transitioning from the Oval Office to private life was both liberating and reflective. I had the freedom to devote more time to family, personal interests, and broader contributions to society, while also carrying the enduring lessons and responsibilities of having served as president during some of the most challenging years in American history. Even outside the presidency, I remained engaged in national affairs. I offered counsel to subsequent leaders, shared insights on foreign policy and governance, and participated in initiatives aimed at strengthening public institutions. My experience taught me that leadership does not end with holding office. It continues through mentorship, dialogue, and the promotion of civic understanding. I took every opportunity to encourage future generations to engage thoughtfully with the nation's political and social challenges, emphasizing integrity, accountability, and service in addition to matters of governance. I dedicated substantial energy to charitable work, education, and public service. I supported programs that enhanced opportunities for young people, promoted health initiatives, and encouraged civic participation. I believed, and still believe, that the measure of a citizen and of a leader is reflected in the willingness to contribute to the common good, to invest time, resources, and energy in endeavors that strengthen communities and uplift society. These years allowed me to act on these principles in ways that were personally meaningful and socially impactful. Reflecting on American democracy and the institution of the presidency, I often shared my thoughts with students, scholars, and the public. I emphasized the resilience of our constitutional system, the importance of checks and balances, and the enduring significance of transparency and accountability. Having witnessed crises like Watergate, economic turbulence, and international tension firsthand, I recognized both the vulnerabilities and strengths of the presidency. My reflections were guided by a desire to ensure that future leaders, and the public at large, understood the gravity, responsibility, and ethical demands inherent in the highest office. During these years, I also reflected on the evolving challenges facing the nation. Social, economic, and international landscapes continued to change, and I engaged in discussions about the future direction of policy, diplomacy, and civic life. I offered perspectives informed by experience, but always mindful that the country belongs to its people and that leadership must remain responsive to evolving circumstances. I sought to encourage constructive dialogue, thoughtful decision-making, and a deep appreciation for the responsibilities that each generation bears toward its citizens and institutions. Ultimately, my post-presidency years were a continuation of service, though expressed through different avenues. They were years of mentorship, reflection, advocacy, and engagement in public life, framed by the understanding that leadership is not confined to holding office. I found fulfillment in contributing to education, charitable initiatives, and civic understanding, and in sharing the lessons learned through a lifetime of public service. These decades were a testament to the enduring influence of principled leadership, the importance of ethical responsibility, and the capacity for every citizen to contribute to the nation's welfare. Looking back, I see this period as an opportunity to solidify the legacy of public service beyond politics. It was a time to reinforce the values of honesty, integrity, and dedication that I had strived to uphold as president. Engaging with citizens, supporting meaningful initiatives, and reflecting on the evolution of the presidency allowed me to participate in shaping the moral and civic fabric of the nation, even outside formal office. These years were a reminder that leadership, in its truest form, is a lifelong commitment to the public good, and that the responsibility to serve does not end with a term in office. It continues as long as one has the capacity and willingness to act for the betterment of society. Looking back on my time in the presidency, I often reflect on the role I played during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. I stepped into the office under extraordinary circumstances, following a crisis of trust, a shaken nation, and a government under intense scrutiny. My tenure was brief, yet every decision carried immense weight, shaping not only my own legacy, but also the future of the office I held. I have always approached this reflection with honesty, humility, and an understanding of the responsibility that leadership entails. That I view my presidency as a period defined by the effort to restore trust and stability. In the aftermath of Watergate, the American people were disillusioned and uncertain about the integrity of their government. One of my foremost objectives was to help the nation heal, to demonstrate that leadership can be principled, transparent, and accountable. Actions like the pardon of Richard Nixon were controversial, yet they were guided by a desire to prioritize the nation's cohesion and long-term well-being over immediate political gain. Leadership is not always popular, but it must be rooted in responsibility and the greater good. Throughout my time in office, I learned that trust is fragile, but it can be rebuilt through consistent, ethical, and transparent governance. Whether managing domestic policy, economic challenges, or international affairs, my guiding principle was to act with integrity, communicate openly, and prioritize the nation's interests above all else. Crisis tests character, and I believe that a president's true measure lies in the courage to make difficult decisions, the humility to accept criticism, and the wisdom to focus on what truly matters for the country and its citizens. To future American leaders, I would offer this counsel. The presidency demands more than ambition or intellect. It requires moral clarity, perseverance, and a commitment to service that transcends personal or political gain. Leadership is about understanding the weight of responsibility, balancing competing pressures, and guiding the nation with honesty and foresight. The challenges may change over time: economic crises, international conflicts, or domestic discord, but the principles of integrity, transparency, and accountability remain timeless. That I hope that my experiences serve as a reminder that public service is a solemn trust. Every action, every decision, and every word can resonate far beyond the immediate moment, affecting the lives of millions and shaping the nation's future. The lessons I learned, from Watergate and economic turbulence to Cold War diplomacy and domestic policy, underscore the importance of thoughtful decision-making, principled action, and unwavering dedication to the common good. Ultimately, my place in history is not defined solely by the office I held, the controversies I faced, or the elections I won or lost, but by the commitment to serve faithfully, to act with integrity, and to prioritize the welfare of the American people. I hope that future leaders remember that the presidency is a stewardship, not a personal achievement, and that their legacy will be measured by their ability to preserve trust, uphold democratic values, and guide the nation through both triumph and adversity. In reflecting on my life and career, I am heartened by the resilience of the American people, the enduring strength of our institutions, and the capacity of leadership to inspire confidence, unity, and progress. My presidency, brief as it was, taught me that even in difficult times, principled leadership can make a difference, that courage and integrity matter, and that service to the nation is both an honor and a solemn responsibility. These are the thoughts I leave for the future, a testament to the enduring principles that guide our democracy and the timeless duty of leadership.